Yeah, well, and it was just, gosh, I read it years and years and years ago, and when I owned a bookstore, and I remember being so impressed with it that I recommended it to everybody who came in who I thought liked the kind of books I did.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I read it, it was the first time in a long time I'd read a book where I actually laughed out loud.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it
Oh,
had the funniest stuff in it. And I checked on Amazon. I can't get the book from the library, and I checked on Amazon or Kindle, and it's like 15, 16 bucks for a paperback of it. It's still in print, but it's not easy to get.
Do you do Kindle at all? Sometimes Kindle is cheaper.
It was still like over $10.
Okay, all right, yeah. Yeah.
is it based on a true story or is it just a fiction?
It's fiction, I think.
Yeah.
I think
mean,
so too.
Probably John Nichols wrote it, and I think he wrote about that area.
Yeah.
He wrote another about that area, Milagro. So I think it's a real place, and it may be based on real events.
I think I would say it's probably fictional because the really nice placement of a whole bunch of different types is too convenient.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Mom who didn't grow up in the bad part of town. Dad who could have left but chose to stay. You know, the step brother. All of those are real things that happen, but to have everything kind of align perfectly in life.
Yeah, I was thinking. Yeah, I mean there were some really like a lot of really positive things in her life, which made the other stuff manageable.
I think what's really good about that though, Mary, is that there's way too much of a myth in America of everything's wrong in Black lives, right? A whole bunch of, like Khalil had mom on a junkie mom, right? And too often that's the story of every Black kid. Well, it's not really.
Yeah, right.
There's a whole lot more. And for example, the Black church is powerful in those neighborhoods too. And so they are not without a lot of resources, and we too easily write off.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's at least part of what he's trying to show with this. Dad is miraculous, isn't he?
Yeah, he is. He really is.
But can you imagine having some of the conversations that he chose to have with his kids, and that are not an untypical type of conversation, like just the starting conversation. Got to look calm. Got to put your hands on the dashboard. You got to do all these things. We don't have to teach that to our white kids.
Right, you don't. And I was even thinking when that whole car scene happened, it was like Khalil should have had that training.
Oh, you know what? I'm talking about a different movie. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'm talking about Milagro Beanfield Wars.
Oh, okay. I read that book. Yes, I read that book.
We'll be talking about that next week.
So we're talking.
I asked you the movie and you told me that, so I thought that was tonight.
No, that's next week. This week it's The Hate You Give.
I haven't seen that movie.
Oh no. Okay. Well, we can't say too much about it.
No, we can say everything so she can go watch it, because you ought to watch that movie, because it's an incredible movie that makes it so that you feel what it is, at least partially, what it is that a young Black girl has to go through. Her best friend is killed as she sits in the car with him, or stands beside him, by a police officer. And the all too common story of Black America, somebody that they know has been killed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We're talking about with, like, I have a friend who's the mother of a 17-year-old 6'5" black young man, and he's off to college now. But
Huh?
it's like, she and I were talking because I said, you know, if I had Isaiah for a son, I'd be terrified
Mm-hmm.
because she has to have conversations with him that I never had to have with my son.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in this day and age, if I were a mother of a black child, I mean, or even married to somebody who's black or dating someone who's black or anything, it's like that's a whole nother world that you enter into that's we don't have to even think about.
Yeah. There's an interesting movie that's out right now. It's on Netflix, I believe. I think it's a Netflix movie. It's called, I think, American Son. And it all plays out in the waiting room of a police station.
I've seen that. Kerry Washington.
Yeah, and she's
haven't.
marvelous. Kerry Washington is the mother of this American son, 18-year-old, just barely an adult, right? And dad is white, and so the interplay of all kinds of different racial things going back and forth, and economic things as well, because mom and dad are both very successful. And kid is trying to say, what does that mean for me as I graduate from high school and move towards college? It's a disturbing film because it's one of those films that I kind of go, did I like it?
I know. Very, very, and the way the police interacted with her compared to how they interacted with her husband.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it was totally different. I mean, everything changed once he entered the picture.
Yeah. And it's just a very interesting. I mean, all of this is extremely interesting for us as white America, because I think we keep reacting to this situation as if, well, they should just have what I have. They should just see it the way I see it. They should just, and again, what these are showing is that's not what they get to do.
That's not their experience.
That's not their experience. And some of that is because we are to blame. This movie tried not to excuse the black community either. King, who was the bad guy in many ways, it is not trying to excuse what he is bringing into their lives, as well as the challenge that he is. He's a drug dealer, all of that. But it does try to say, what do we do from here? What do we do?
Mm-hmm. And what's really disturbing to me right now is because we want things to change, right?
Uh-huh.
We want things to change. I think most of us want things to change. And the politics that are happening right now, to me, are so toxic.
Yeah, and definitely getting in the way of that, because people are beyond just their own, I don't want to admit my privilege. There's also this political thing that makes it so that they have to fight against some of them moving towards.
Yeah.
And that's
people just saying it's that they're whatever, it's all their fault, and they just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and
That's our fearless narcissistic leader too. So I mean, he's
yeah.
Well, I mean, he's literally praising the guy, the white supremacist guy who shot people.
Yeah, and he tells the narrative as if it was he had the right to defend himself narrative.
Yes.
he didn't even have to go there. He didn't have to. He wasn't even supposed to have a gun, and yet he's being
He probably
praised.
state funds that gun too to get there.
Yeah, yeah. So
But how many people now are buying into that?
well, the
Well,
whole. Have you heard
when
how much?
when I see big old white pickup truck with Trump has flag and an American flag hanging big time going down Sunrise in front of me with these flags just unfurled and flying proud. I mean, he has this. He's got a lot of people buying into this, and I even have this neighbor, Chris, who is a really nice guy, as long as we don't talk politics. And I mentioned this morning, he was like, well, I wish they just, I wish the politics were over. I said, yeah, me too. I said, I'll be in the pandemic. And I said, yeah, if they just listen to the scientists. He go, and then he starts in about Fauci being part of this conspiracy with Melinda and Bill Gates, and how they're Marxists and they want this globalization, and they're like they want the world all to be this one big global thing, and I'm just like, I just said, Chris, don't vote.
Yeah.
And I walked off, because how do you answer? I mean, that is so. He's listening to Rush Limbaugh on Fox News, and there's absolutely nothing I could say to him.
There isn't.
That would reach him, because he is so steeped. I mean, if you think Bill and Melinda Gates are Marxists and for global, and you're against globalization, then I don't know what to say to you.
That's right. And the hard part is what you're talking about is there is a lot of fake news out there. The problem is people are calling fake news what isn't fake news, right?
Right.
That dynamic of being able to just yell out fake news means that I don't have to listen to anything I don't want to listen to, which typically means all I have to label as news is what my opinion is about the news. And opinions aren't news.
Well, I know, but they're being told by the president that Fox News is the only true news.
Actually, I think it's more insidious than that. I think he's basically telling them only I have the real news.
Yes.
Not even Fox News. He's even discrediting Fox News as the news source. I'm the only, and that's always dangerous.
Very.
Always dangerous.
So I'm genuinely scared about that. I'm really scared about where our country's headed and if he gets reelected. So
yeah.
I think if anything's bothering me right now, that's really, I mean, not that, the pandemic is bad but we're all doing our best to, wear masks and social distance. I'm even back at work, and, I see everybody that I'm working with complying and all that. But what's scary to me is where we're going, where our country's headed. And
I agree.
And
that scares me a lot.
Yeah.
Or even loses if he's willing. I mean, he's got a military and he's got an awful lot of people who would fight to keep him in office, even if he loses.
The good news, Beauty, though, now, I don't know if you noticed that in the last poll that I saw talking about military support of President Trump. And, military by oath follow the president. But by politics, there are more according to this poll, more people in the military voting against Trump than for him.
Yes. I've also heard top military leaders who are denouncing Trump. So that's hopeful.
Yeah.
But he's still armed militias who've been willing to fight for him.
I know. That's that. and militia is always more uncertain, you know, unpredictable. So getting back to the thing though, I think in that hate we give, the key element happened right at the end, but it had been mentioned earlier, and I think that's where we want to go, is the thing about what the hate you give stands for. The hate you give, thug, T-H-U-G, and it's a quote by Tupac,
Right. Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
Tupac
That's what
says,
they say.
"The hate you give little infants F's everything," right?
Right. Hmm.
And the whole story behind this is, here she is and says, what do I do to make it so that whatever's going on here in the midst of this shooting, in the midst of this struggle, in the midst of this death, how do I not pass on this hate to little brother or to other people? And I think, Judy, that's a lot of what we're dealing with in the whole thing. Trump is really good at passing on hate.
Yes, and fear.
And fear. So how do we stand in such a way that we don't do that? In these racial issues right now, it's become vogue by my conservative side to just blame everything and hate them more, right? Look at how they're tearing down Portland. Look at how crime is rising. Look at how. So how do we not give into that? How do we stand between the guns, essentially?
Honestly, other than Chris, I don't have anyone in my life that I come in contact with who, you know, I don't have people like you do, Jim, in my life who are Trump supporters and really conservatives or anything.
Yeah.
So I don't have to deal with them other than Chris this morning. I am seeing the Trump heads. And if I see the American flag flying, I generally know, okay, you're going to be a Trump supporter, which is sad.
Which is sad. But usually if they're flying out of somebody's truck,
Yeah.
yes. Pretty
Yes.
much if somebody's flying it from their truck, you can pretty much say.
Oh, yeah.
But I do have a few people in my life that are Republican, and I just don't discuss it with them. Because for one thing, they're not, my immediate family is not like that. But which I'm divorced right now, but my husband's side of the family is very Republican. They're Mormons, most of them, not all of them. And so I've heard that kind of stuff from them. And I actually ended up unfollowing a lot of them on Facebook, even though I was friends with them, because I couldn't read the stuff they were posting, you know, the ones that got political. I stayed friends with the ones that were just posting family photos, weren't posting a lot of political stuff. And then I've run into people at work, believe it or not. I was shocked actually that a couple of the teachers that I work with are very Republican. And so I tend to avoid those conversations because it doesn't seem to accomplish anything.
The problem though, I don't disagree with you. That's absolutely very true often. But let's talk, for example, about, you mentioned Rush Limbaugh earlier. Rush Limbaugh has been around a little over 20 years now, since the early 1990s. So close to 30 years now. And I think that not talking is what gave him power. Because my conservative friends, they would listen to that. They might bring it up and I would pass it off as, that's just stupid. I don't even want to get in that fight. And it gained power because they just kept listening and listening and listening to this crazy version of the world that was trying to get ratings rather than somebody being in real conversations with them and stopping that slide. And it got too powerful. And you're right that it is very difficult now. But that's because it's been 30 years worth of people listening and assuming that that's true. And it's not just Rush, but he is.
I know, but he's a big part. And back in the 90s, you're right. The people I knew that were listening, or the people I ran into who were listening to Rush, had those ideas.
Yeah.
And I would say stuff like, oh, he tells a bunch of lies, he's full of BS. And then they, no, he isn't. It's the, and you're not. So I didn't argue with them. You're right. I avoided conflict because
And you're not alone in that. It's hard to figure out.
I don't know.
Step into things like that. Go ahead, Judy.
I don't think that's totally true, Jim, because, okay, I had an uncle back in the early days when we're talking, I don't even know, was this even the 90s? He must have been around since before the 90s because
he was around before the 90s, not far before the 90s, but
my uncle was listening. When I first moved to Arizona, my uncle lived in Tucson, and that's the reason why I got down to Tucson from Phoenix. And my uncle was an engineer at Hughes at the time, and he listened to Rush Limbaugh. And he would start in on this stuff, about Rush Limbaugh and stuff. And I go, how could an educated man like you even believe this stuff? And it's like, he would totally, it didn't matter what I said, or he still was going to believe Limbaugh. It's like he was set on that. And I totally having those conversations would have made a whole lot of difference to a lot of people. I think there's a group of a segment of the population who's going to believe that kind of thing no matter what you say.
You may be right, but
that's thinking.
Yeah, but I want to not think that. I want to think that relationship will always help in situations like this. And it's tough. It's tough because, look, you got to know my cousins. I got hillbilly cousins up in the mountains of Arizona, right? And they're tough to change.
Mm-hmm.
They pride themselves on being Wilt Bank stubborn.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I think relationship helps because we modulate ourselves when we are in spaces where we choose love with each other. And I mean, my conservative friends modulate themselves as well as my liberal friends.
Well, I would never talk politics at a family gathering with Jeff's family. And if they were talking politics, I'd usually walk out of the room or go outside for a walk or something.
I know it's tough.
Because it's family, and it's not even my family.
Right.
My direct family, it was like I didn't want to, and my kids were little, and I think a couple times I said, I just don't believe that, or I basically made a claim that I don't believe that, but I didn't really want to. A family gathering wasn't the time to argue about.
Yeah, the hard part is it's tough to figure out what to do. Like with Star in the movie, here she lives, in Garden Heights, and then goes to Williamson High School.
Right.
Williamson High School is one of the suburban, rich, white, mostly white schools. Garden Heights is a black neighborhood, and very different worlds. To the extent that she says, "I have Star 1 and Star 2," and they're very different manifestations of who I am. And all of us have that to some degree. right? We do with our spouse's family act differently than what we might do with our own family,
Uh-huh.
right? There's permissions or abilities that we have in one place that's not in the other.
Mm-hmm.
But I love that at the end of the movie, she ended up saying, essentially, that she's leaving Star 2 behind because she has to be her true self.
Mm-hmm.
And what is her true self? And I think that's part of what we have to decide. When is it that we have to speak truth? How is it that we have to speak truth? And we can be in that moment just as bad as what they can be. So it's not like I have truth and only truth. It's not that type of thing. But we do have to figure out how to be in a space where we're not allowing faults to go on. So like on Facebook, here's what I tend to do. I tend not to argue with their opinions, as stupid as what those are. But when they post something that has verifiable falsehood to it, I call them on that.
That's a good thing. Yes.
Right? And there's a
Right.
lot of that going on in the political conversations. Like
Right.
one time my cousin Bob posted a meme because he wanted it to be true, but the meme was actually not just the meme, it was the link to the Snopes account that said it was false.
Ah!
Right? His very post was about how that was false, but he was using it as if this is what I want to be true, so it is true. So I praised him. I said, Bob, you finally got it right. You showed that this type of thinking is wrong. Good job. He didn't like that very much.
No.
The problem is that in areas like this, we think that there's, okay, so one thing that people will fall back on quite often is we can't know what the fact is, and so my opinion's as good as anyone's. Well, no, we can know what some of the facts are. And when it comes down to opinion, you're right, your opinion may be as good as someone else's, but you can't match your opinion against a fact, right? So I used with her, they live in this little community and it has this little mesa right next to it, and it's called Flat Top. And I said, the fact is that Flat Top sits there. Now you can argue about whether it's a hill or it's a mountain. You can argue about whether you should go up there for a picnic or not. But the fact is that you can't argue Flat Top out of fact. You can't, you can't opinion Flat Top out. It's there. That's the fact, right? And sometimes what I feel like people are doing is they're saying, I don't want to believe that's true, and so my opinion is that it's not, and that's my fact. Well, no, it's
Or
true.
they're saying that's the facts aren't the facts.
That's right. And you have to say, no, this is the fact. It's verifiable. It's provable. You can argue about what to do with it, right? Doesn't mean that my opinion about what to do with it is right, but the reality is this is true.
But
So,
then
for
they
example, in this movie,
crush people who say that you say are the fact, like Chris saying that Fauci, is full of it, or something. It's like they'll discount the people who are putting out the facts.
I know, but see, President Trump is really good at giving them permission to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But on racial issues, the facts are pretty clear. We have consistently through our history done things to make it so that the road for Black America is much more difficult than and for any colored America, for Hispanic America, it is much more difficult than what it is for white America. We can talk about the reality of schools, right? Schools in poor areas of our cities, read areas of color in our city, are consistently underfunded compared to compared to the white areas of that same city. Consistently. Not
There's also finding that in the 1930s.
And has been since the 1930s. And it's not just that. In this movie, it showed a very real dynamic. At one point, right at the beginning, she's talking about her neighborhood. And she says, look, there's Mr. Peabody's barbecue. And over here is Mr. Lewis's barbershop. And here's Daddy's store. Walmart is 32 minutes away.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
those are verifiable facts about what happened in Black neighborhoods. It's called redlining. That red lines were drawn around cities, essentially around areas of the city where commerce was discouraged and removed. And so those areas are substantially without services.
And even just like having, I read the news every morning, and there, is talking about in Black neighborhoods that there's substantially no trees. You look at the plate, this woman, I think it was Austin or something, would walk like an hour to take her children to a playground in a suburb where they actually had trees covering the slides and things, because in the where she lived there were no trees.
Yeah. And many of those public service things are lacking. If you go to a poor neighborhood, sidewalks will tend to be less present or less well maintained.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it's all those things that we should be standing to say that neighborhood needs that type of service at least as much as my neighborhood does. At least as much. And yet right now in most American cities, that's not as true.
Mm-hmm.
And so our Black brothers and sisters are having to figure out how to deal without some of that superstructure that we take for granted. Much of that superstructure that we take for granted. And are we going to be aware of that? Or do we just allow it to be a story?
Or even, I know in the Honem Nation, they're building this wall right through their sacred places.
Yeah.
The indigenous people from several places got together to go down and protest, and I wanted to go, well, where are all the whites? Why are we not down there joining them, doing that?
Yeah, and we should ask ourselves that. And part of the reason why we don't join it is because, well, it's not my issue. Or, well, you know what, there's like, I thought about this with all of the Black protests here in Tucson. I'm far away at that moment. I was up in San Jose area. But I came back and it was more of a, well, COVID. I don't want to bring COVID home to, and it's like we can find excuses easy.
I'm physically not able to. I figured I did my protesting in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to say wrong. I'm trying to say we have to see that there's always easy ways to be able to explain it away.
COVID is a real reason, though.
I know that, but it doesn't mean we have to check ourselves out. For example, during the midst of that, we had people who were going to that. Do we do something? Do we connect up with them and say, I'm with you. Will you please, I made a sign. Will you carry this sign with you? Do we support those who are willing to still do those things?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that we have to not listen to some of those warning spaces, because maybe we do need to stay away. But what can we do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I haven't been out to any of the recent protests. I've been in other protests. But but I have not been in the Black Lives Matter one. But I have made a couple donations to organizations
Good.
that,
Yeah.
help.
Yeah. The tough part is that there's no easy solution to this, and it will always take us out of simple places for us,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because
Yeah.
because much of it is going to happen in neighborhoods where we are not, right? Much of it means that we have to get out of the comfort zone of what is ours and move and go into those spaces. When Rosa was in sanctuary, she was in sanctuary at, Southside Presbyterian, which is way down off of 22nd Street by the freeway. So I had to decide, do I travel down there once a week and do a devotion for her? Because it's never convenient to do something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to decide, do you do that? Do you give some of your money too? Do you, talk on the phone to, do you make more phone calls to your legislators and say, this is what I feel about? So it takes time, it takes energy, it takes money, it takes whatever it is that you choose to give. And in some ways, it's not so that you get the benefit, but so that the society
Mm-hmm.
gets a benefit. Because I think to a very real extent, our society is only as good as our poorest, whereas some people try to sell it as we're as good as our wealthiest. And I think it's our poorest that show our true measure of society.
Mm-hmm.
So what are we doing to help in those situations? For me, it comes down to just a simple thing too. If I like having the sidewalks I have, if I think I deserve those sidewalks, why am I looking at neighborhoods and not expecting that they deserve those sidewalks as well?
Mm-hmm.
If I deserve a grocery store somewhere close to me, why don't I expect that they have a grocery store somewhere close to them?
And, I don't get the schools thing, because don't they get the same amount per student? Like TUSD, don't all the schools get the same amount per student? Somebody told me, oh, well, the PTA in that school is much wealthier and they've, raised money to do this and that, put in nicer playground equipment or whatever.
Yeah. So let me tell you something specific along those lines, Mary. I can't address all of the reasons. There's lots of different reasons why it is, but let me tell you about one in particular that we ought to do something about. In Arizona law, there is a thing where you can every year donate $200, $400 as a couple, and get tax credit to that.
I've done that.
Okay, so Catalina Foothills receives a massive amount of money that way. Why? Because the people around Catalina Foothills are richer, at least, right? And they receive a lot of money, but they don't need that money near as much as what like Sunnyside needs.
Right.
But who are the parents around? Who are the people around Sunnyside? Usually labor, more on the labor side of things, with not a lot of extra cash, right? And so Catalina Foothills, which already gets quite a good support from its population, now gets more money that way.
That's true.
And there's several things built into the system where it's easier to do that. Richer districts that have more commercial areas can pass an override much simpler, can pass a bond very easily. And the poorer districts have more of a challenge to do that. And an override can be 10% extra into that school district every year.
But, so you're saying a lot of it has to do with the school district itself?
A lot of it has to do with the funding that's set up in our state, okay, which can favor wealthy school districts over poor school districts, poor school areas.
Well, I can see how the tax credit does that.
And the charter schools also take money from the public schools.
They do. They do. And I don't know what all the solutions are to that, but as a school district employee, for the 14 years that I was there, it would have been better for all of us if we were truly and really state employees, not just district employees. So when I first came into the state, 1984, I started at a school district that was paying the third highest beginning teacher salary in the state. Okay? A few years before that, they were one of the lowest paying. You know the difference? Tucson Electric Power chose to put a power plant near this district, thus becoming more than 80% of the tax base for those little towns, that school district. And so, in the time that I was there, we passed a bond issue that built a domed football stadium for their high school football team.
Wow.
Why?
Wow.
Because because Tucson Electric Power was paying 80% of the tax base. And so what your tax base is has a whole.
So you're saying the school district itself had more money because of the tax base.
And that those folks who didn't have a lot of money, right? It's a relatively middle to poor class, poor area. Nobody of big strong wealth, and suddenly we, the taxpayers, could elect ourselves all these things. Every school, because of that tax base, was brand new in that district.
Wow.
Okay, because of that tax base. I think that's great for that school district, but it meant that people in Tucson on their bills were probably getting a little higher of a rate because you were supporting schools up in the mountains. Because it's based on a weird system like that. And so bedroom communities that don't have a lot of commerce or don't have a lot of commercial, industrial, they are always going to struggle to have enough money to pay for the or to have. And every school district, there's not a school district I know that has too much money.
No, of course.
All schools in Arizona are relatively underfunded, but those that are doing the best are often like the Catalina foothills, Scottsdale up in Phoenix area, right? That can essentially help themselves.
But but answer this. As far as state money goes, doesn't every school get the same amount of state money?
Kind of, yeah.
Based on student?
Yeah,
like
there's basic formulas that allow you to do that. Part of that, you've noticed that over the last little while, there's been a big push for doing 100-day celebrations. You know why?
No.
Because your count on your 100th day is part of what makes it, what sets that formula.
Oh, right. I have heard that.
Okay, and so poor districts, and it's not about poor, it's about economically lower districts also have a higher rate of absenteeism And
Mhm.
so even though they may have more kids, sometimes they get funded at a lesser level because um, it's harder to get the full contingent of school out. Okay, so does that make sense?
Yes.
And
Mhm.
so poor districts have to work really hard to try to make sure in that moment. So we're going in all kinds of different directions, and it's not bad discussion. The difficulty is it doesn't solve like that. These kinds of issues are built in and strong, and we have to decide what are we going to do to try to do something. There's not a perfect answer. Mom in the story said, we got to move out of this neighborhood, make it safer for our kids. That's a valid thing to be able to say. Dad's point was, we've got to build up this neighborhood so that this is a better neighborhood for our kids. A different idea, also with a lot of validity, but we're each going to have to struggle with what do we do. And it's not an issue of I want to have less so that they have enough. We just have to be able to say, if this is what is reasonable, how do we make sure everyone has it and fight for that type of thing? What is it that every kid should have? What is it that families should be able to expect from us as a government?
Well, access to good housing.
Yeah.
For one thing, access to good schools.
Yeah. And we have to sometimes go out of our way to make sure that we find the school that right now doesn't have some of that. We find the neighborhood that doesn't have some of that. And start trying to work with those areas to say, I'm with you as you get what is fair. Not necessarily at the expense of what I would get, but if I think it's okay for me, then it should be okay for
Mm-hmm.
whoever.
One thing I know that the to, I have to say, give them kudos for a lot of things they did. One of them was they adopted, what was the name of the school? They adopted the school, the grade school that's right across from Tucson High, right across.
Yeah,
And
what one you want.
Roscourge.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. Yeah.
and they set up a food pantry there. They started a mentoring program with the students. And they really went in there and started working directly with the kids in that school.
Mm-hmm.
Who is this that did this?
The church where she was at.
Yeah,
Oh, right. Uh-huh.
University City Church was what it was. Evangelical church that I left. But they did that. I have to give them kudos for that. That was a great thing they did.
Yeah.
Still doing it.
So that's part of the bottom line is how do we get into connection with whoever it is we get in connection with so that we begin to do that same type of work, right? And what we don't want to do, kind of like with the $200 tax credit, we don't want to get in connection with Joni's school. Joni has a great school. She has kids who need help and whatnot. But they have relative advantage. How do we get in contact like with school down along Grant Avenue, right? Where we have some poor neighborhoods relatively close to us and do that same type of thing. Adopt a school.
Mm-hmm.
And the hard part is with COVID, it's a little more challenging right now with all the distance learning, but we have to start deciding what do we do in those areas.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the folks that Barbara Eisworth is dealing with are people who are here with relative disadvantage. Families that are trying to figure out how to negotiate a new country in some ways. Do we stay very strongly connected with them and be more of a companion for them on their journey.
One good thing is I know that the kids that could come back to school were the refugee kids. That was one group.
Yeah.
So that was a good thing. And I haven't done it for a while, but yeah, volunteering with like Iskashita
That's right. That's right.
is volunteering and like, and St. Francis does a lot of that.
That's right. And I think that's what we have to look at as a church is what else can we do? Where has something gone? Are we getting as many Iskashita volunteers as we used to? Well, maybe it's time to re-recruit that way. What else do we open up so that people can step into some of those roles and be there in some of those areas? We're at the end of our time.
Okay. Oh my gosh.
The tough part is that you guys didn't quite solve all the issues this movie brings up.
We didn't. We tried. We didn't though. We did try.
Remember that next week we are doing the Milagros movie,
The Milagro Beanfield War.
Milagro Beanfield War. And so watch that movie, and it's a great movie. Robert Redford directed it, and we'll have a good discussion.
Yeah.
I will send to you afterwards. I don't know if I sent it to the yesterday's class. Anyway, I have the list of all the movies coming up, and we'll get that to Melissa, so it's in the bulletin, and as well as get it to not in the bulletin, but in the stuff she sends out, and you can see the whole thing. All right.
I would expect more people are going to be coming eventually, right?
I hope so.
Because
all right, my friends, take care.
Movies are fun, so
They are
thank
fun, aren't
you.
they?
Yes, so you take care too, everybody.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.